Germanwings Flight 9525. On March 24, 2015, an Airbus A320 climbs out of Barcelona bound for Dusseldorf, with Captain Patrick Sondenheimer and co-pilot Andreas Lubitz in the cockpit. The morning is calm. The cabin crew moves through the aisle with the breakfast trolley, and 150 people settle in for a routine flight over southern France. Passengers doze against windows. A few tap through work emails, and the low hum of the engines fills the cabin like it does on any other day. Roughly 20 minutes in, the captain leaves the cockpit for the lavatory, a normal procedure repeated thousands of times a day around the world. Lubitz reaches over and quietly locks the reinforced door behind him. On the other side, Sondenheimer knocks, first softly, then harder, his voice rising as he calls through the intercom. No answer comes back. Inside, Lubitz begins adjusting the descent rate on the autopilot, calmly, deliberately, lowering the plane toward the mountains below. The knocking turns into pounding, then into the sound of something being used to try to force the door open. Passengers can be heard on the recovered cockpit voice recorder, some praying, some screaming, as the Alps rise closer through the windshield. Lubitz's breathing stays steady the entire time. The aircraft strikes a ridge near Prats-Haute-Bléone at high speed. All 150 people aboard are killed instantly, and investigators later confirmed the descent was intentional, carried out by a co-pilot who had hidden a medical diagnosis from his employer. Helios Airways Flight 522. On August 14, 2005, a Boeing 737 leaves Larnaca, Cyprus for Athens, carrying 121 passengers and crew. Ground engineers had performed a pressurization check the night before and left a critical switch in the wrong position. As the plane climbs past 10,000 feet, a warning horn sounds in the cockpit, the same horn used for both a pressurization fault and a takeoff configuration error, and the pilots misidentify which one it is. The cabin altitude climbs steadily as oxygen thins. Passengers grow drowsy, some slump in their seats. Flight attendants struggle to stay alert while trying to hand out oxygen masks. In the cockpit, the pilots lose consciousness within minutes, still strapped into their seats, hands frozen mid-motion. The plane continues climbing on autopilot, level, steady, and utterly uncontrolled, drifting toward Athens exactly as programmed but with no one able to respond to anything. Below, Greek fighter jets are scrambled to intercept the silent aircraft. Pilots flying alongside see the captain's seat empty and passengers slumped, unmoving. Only one person remains conscious, a flight attendant named Andreas Prodromou, who had been trained as a pilot and enters the cockpit wearing a portable oxygen bottle. He takes the controls just as the fuel runs out. Both engines flame out one after another, and the aircraft glides into hills near Grammatico, killing everyone on board. Payne Stewart's Learjet. On October 25, 1999, a Learjet 35 departs Orlando for Dallas, carrying professional golfer Payne Stewart along with 5 others. The takeoff is unremarkable, radio contact with air traffic control is normal, and the small jet climbs steadily toward its cruising altitude over Florida. For a short while, everything about the flight looks exactly like any other private charter that morning. Then, controllers notice the jet is no longer responding. Repeated calls go unanswered, and the aircraft continues climbing well past its assigned altitude, eventually leveling off near 45,000 feet, a height far beyond normal cruise for that plane. A slow, gradual loss of cabin pressure had gone unnoticed and unaddressed inside, and everyone aboard loses consciousness within minutes as the air thins around them. Fighter jets are scrambled to fly alongside the aircraft. Pilots report frost coating the inside of the windows, a telltale sign of a depressurized cabin at extreme cold. No movement is visible inside, no one waves, no one reacts to the jets flying just off the wingtip. The Learjet continues on autopilot for nearly 4 hours, drifting across the country from Florida toward South Dakota, before finally running out of fuel. It spirals down and crashes into a field near Aberdeen, killing all 6 people aboard. Aeroflot Flight 593. On March 23, 1994, an Airbus A310 cruises through the night over Siberia, carrying 75 passengers and crew from Moscow to Hong Kong. Captain Yaroslav Kudrinsky is at the controls, and partway through the flight he invites his 2 teenage children into the cockpit, a practice that was against regulations but not unusual for the airline at the time. His son Eldar, 15 years old, is seated at the controls. With the autopilot engaged, Eldar is allowed to hold the control yoke while his father watches, and the boy turns it slightly to the side, curious to feel the aircraft respond. Unknown to either of them, this partially disengages the autopilot's control of the ailerons while keeping the autopilot indicator lit. The plane begins rolling gently to one side, unnoticed at first, before the bank angle grows steeper than anyone in the cockpit realizes. Warnings begin sounding as the roll deepens into a spiral. The pilots, confused about which systems are actually controlling the aircraft, pull and push at the controls without disengaging the autopilot properly. The plane pitches steeply, nearly inverts, and enters a dive so severe that passengers and loose items are thrown against the cabin ceiling. The crew manages brief recovery attempts, but the aircraft strikes terrain near Mezhdureshensk at high speed, killing all 75 people aboard. Japan Airlines Flight 123. On August 12, 1985, a Boeing 747 departs Tokyo's Haneda Airport for Osaka, carrying 524 passengers and crew on what should be a short domestic hop. 7 years earlier, the same aircraft had suffered a tail strike, and the subsequent repair to the rear pressure bulkhead had been done incorrectly, leaving a hidden weakness that no one aboard could see or suspect. Around 12 minutes after takeoff, a loud bang echoes through the cabin as the bulkhead finally fails at cruising altitude. The explosive decompression tears away most of the vertical tail fin and severs all 4 hydraulic lines, the systems that normally let pilots steer the aircraft. Oxygen masks drop, the cabin fills with mist from the sudden pressure change, and the plane begins a slow, sickening series of oscillations that the crew cannot correct with the control column. For the next 32 minutes, the pilots fight to control a plane that no longer responds to normal inputs, using only engine thrust to steer left, right, up and down. Passengers write final notes to their families as the aircraft weaves over the mountains near Mount Takamagahara. Despite the crew's efforts, the plane strikes a ridge and breaks apart. 520 of the 524 aboard are killed, making it the deadliest single aircraft accident in history. ValueJet, Flight 592. On May 11, 1996, a McDonnell Douglas DC-9 climbs out of Miami bound for Atlanta, carrying 110 passengers and crew. In the cargo hold beneath the cabin sit boxes of chemical oxygen generators, improperly packed and mislabeled by a maintenance contractor, missing the safety caps that would have prevented them from activating. The flight begins routinely, climbing over the Florida Everglades in clear morning air. About 6 minutes after takeoff, one of the generators ignites, sparking a fire in the cargo hold that spreads quickly through packing material and insulation. Smoke begins seeping into the cabin, and the pilots hear a strange commotion from the flight attendants before smelling smoke themselves. Cockpit instruments start failing one by one as wiring burns beneath the floor, and the pilots realize they are losing control of basic systems mid-flight. The crew declares an emergency and turns back toward Miami. But the fire is spreading faster than the aircraft can outrun it. Flight attendants can be heard urging passengers to stay calm as visibility drops and heat rises through the cabin floor. Contact with the aircraft is lost as it enters a steep, uncontrolled dive. It strikes the shallow waters of the Everglades at high speed, disintegrating on impact and killing all 110 people aboard. EgyptAir Flight 990. On October 31, 1999, a Boeing 767 leaves New York's JFK Airport bound for Cairo, carrying 217 passengers and crew on an overnight transatlantic flight. Most of the cabin lights are dimmed, many passengers are asleep, and the flight proceeds normally for the first half hour, cruising steadily over the Atlantic in dark, calm skies. The captain leaves the cockpit for a break, a routine handover on long flights, leaving Relief First Officer Gamil al-Batouti alone at the controls alongside another crew member who is preparing to take a seat. Moments later, al-Batouti disengages the autopilot and pushes the control column forward, sending the aircraft into a steep dive. Cockpit recordings capture him repeating a phrase quietly to himself as the plane's nose drops sharply toward the ocean below. The captain rushes back into the cockpit upon hearing the alarms and struggles against the controls, pulling back as al-Batouti continues pushing forward. Both engines are cut off during the confrontation, and the aircraft briefly climbs before entering a second final dive. It breaks apart from aerodynamic stress and plunges into the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Massachusetts, killing everyone aboard, with investigators later concluding the actions in the cockpit were deliberate. LAM Mozambique Airlines Flight 470. On November 29, 2013, an Embraer 119-0 departs Maputo, Mozambique, bound for Luanda, Angola, carrying 33 passengers and crew. Captain Herminio dos Santos Fernandez is at the controls alongside a first officer, and the early part of the flight passes without incident, cruising over southern Africa under clear skies as passengers settle in for the several-hour journey. Partway through the flight, the first officer leaves the cockpit to use the lavatory, and once he is out, Fernandez locks the door behind him. He begins adjusting the aircraft's altitude settings, pushing the plane into a steady, deliberate descent from cruising height. Outside the locked door, the first officer returns and finds it will not open, knocking at first calmly, then with increasing urgency as he realizes something is wrong. The banging on the cockpit door grows louder, mixed with muffled calls from the first officer trying to get a response. Inside, Fernandez continues the descent uninterrupted, adjusting speed and heading as the plane loses altitude over a remote stretch of Namibian bush. Air traffic controllers lose contact as the aircraft disappears from radar. It crashes into dense forest near the Bwabwada National Park, killing all 33 people aboard, with flight data later confirming the descent had been manually controlled the entire time. SilkAir Flight 185. On December 19, 1997, a Boeing 737 cruises at 35,000 feet over southern Sumatra, flying from Jakarta to Singapore with 97 passengers and crew aboard. Captain Su Wei-ming is at the controls. The flight has been smooth for most of its duration, and the cockpit voice recorder captures ordinary conversation between the pilots in the minutes before cruise continues uneventfully. Then, without any distress call, mechanical warning, or reported weather issue, the flight data recorder stops recording, followed shortly after by the cockpit voice recorder going silent. Radar data shows the aircraft suddenly departing from level flight, entering an extremely steep, almost vertical descent from cruising altitude. Nothing in the final radio transmissions hints at what is happening inside the cockpit in those final seconds. The aircraft plunges toward the ground at a rate far beyond anything survivable, reaching speeds investigators later estimate as supersonic in the dive. It strikes the Musi River near Palembang, Indonesia, at a near vertical angle, disintegrating into fragments scattered across the riverbed and surrounding mudflats. All 97 people aboard are killed instantly, and despite years of investigation, the exact cause of the sudden dive remains one of the most disputed findings in aviation history. If you liked this video, hit subscribe for more like it, and let me know in the comments what you want to see next.